All right. Hello, everyone. We're going to get started. And just a couple of things off the top. During the webinar, if we mean for this to be an interactive conversation, and we'd love to accept questions. You can do those, submit those via the chat function of the webinar. And so please feel free to do that at any point. And then as we go and transition to a Q&A time near the end, we'll try to select from those and and get our panelists to respond to them. So we'll go ahead and get started and look forward to hearing questions as we move through. Well, thank you all for joining us today. This is our sort of privacy by design at the intersection of data strategy and privacy. My name is Michael Helbling. I'm an analytics director here at Search Discovery. Many of you are probably familiar with Search Discovery, but for those who aren't, we're a data transformation company. We work to help companies use data with purpose to drive measurable impact. And I'm very excited to introduce our experts for this panel on this webinar today. So first up is Jody Daniels. Jody is a certified informational privacy professional. She's got more than 20 years of experience helping companies in privacy, marketing, strategy, and also in finance roles. In 2017, she founded Red Clover Advisors and has helped hundreds of companies create privacy programs, achieve GDPR and US privacy compliance, and establish secure online data strategies that their customers can count on. And we're very excited to welcome you, Jody. Thanks for joining the webinar today.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Definitely. Next up is our Senior Director of Data Strategy here at Search Discovery, John Lovett. He's a former senior analyst at Forrester Research, and John is widely recognized in the digital analytics space as a thought leader and has dedicated nearly 20 years to researching, writing, consulting, and speaking on data and analytics. John has served as the president of the Digital Analytics Association, is a certified web analyst and author of Social Media Metrics Secrets. Hello, John.
Hello, thanks for having me.
That's great. And we also have Wendy Erder. She is a director of applied analytics and optimization at Search Discovery. She's an analytics leader with over 17 years of experience, both in digital analytics, usability, information architecture, and digital marketing. And she's worked very closely with a number of clients on GDPR service implementation projects, bringing a practitioner's perspective to the ever-growing world of data privacy. Thanks for being here, Wendy.
Thanks, Michael.
Awesome. Well, we're excited to welcome all of you. It's a pleasure to have you join us. So we'll go ahead and get started. So as an introduction, whether it's current US privacy laws that are happening right now or GDPR, which happened last year, data privacy and data strategy are an important part of any business. Successfully executing against both is often easier said than done. So today we really want to delve into this intersection, both from a privacy perspective and share insights on how data privacy and data strategy can work together in today's world. We really want to cover off on how do you utilize data privacy and data strategy to drive real business impact. What are some of those do's and don'ts and some practical measures and tips? And then how can marketers safely move through and navigate some of these regulatory structures with confidence by leveraging data strategies, and how organizations can use executable data strategies to holistically pursue data privacy with confidence. So let's get started. So I think first up, with GDPR and many more emerging regulations around data privacy, this is not a topic that any organization can ignore anymore. And at a high level, I want to start with a question of how are organizations grappling with this out in the real world? And I'd love to have a few of our panelists weigh in on this, but Jody, maybe you could kick us off.
Sure. So it's probably a good idea to kind of just set the stage, sort of the 1 minute current state of privacy law. And I like to say privacy is sweeping the globe. So we have GDPR. It's almost a year in effect. May 25th, we can have a first birthday celebration. And behind that is the e-privacy directive updating to the e-privacy regulation that will really have a big impact on digital marketing, emails, and cookies. And that draft is coming and expected to pass fairly soon. And then we have what's happening in the United States, which is the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act. That was passed last June, and it's effective in January of 2020. We have about 10 to 12 other states with similar privacy laws on the docket, with the most recent of Washington State. They just passed last week the Washington Privacy Act through the Senate, through the Washington Senate. So now that goes to the Washington House. And I think that will just continue to really have the snowball effect of more and more state privacy laws happening. And honestly, from a global perspective, we also have Brazil. They have a GDPR-like bill. India has one on draft, and I could kind of keep going. So privacy is definitely here to stay. And I think especially for GDPR, companies started. They definitely, kind of got their foot in the door. We might have created some policies or begun to understand what data is being collected, but we still have a ways to go to really make it a fundamental, just a part of everything that we're doing all the time. And especially for any companies who sort of thought they were off the hook for GDPR, now we have California here. And so much of the data discovery, right, understanding what data I have, how do I use it, what am I doing with it, and how I maintain that is going to be super critical for all US companies, whether they have to comply with GDPR or CCPA or whatever future acronym is coming.
One of the things that I'd comment on, just following up on that comment, Jody, is the understanding your data is such a critical component of a data strategy. And that's oftentimes where we start, is taking a look at your source data, where you're collecting it from, and really what you're bringing into your organization. That becomes one of the key things to think about as you're trying to incorporate your data strategy with your privacy efforts. But the question I would put out there also is, a lot of times within a data strategy, we talk about ownership, we talk about stewardship, and really where these things live within an organization. Sometimes it comes down to IT teams, other times legal and regulatory folks get involved. Curious to know, kind of from your perspective, where is there a best place, or is it all dependent on the organization for who takes ownership and accountability over all the, whether it's GDPR or a state law, who kind of owns that, in your opinion?
So my non-attorney legal answer is it depends, but it really does depend on the organization and the type of data that they have and what they're doing with it. But what I would absolutely say is there should be a central sponsor or owner of it. Even if you don't have a full-time privacy person, you should have at least someone on a fractional basis who's responsible for privacy. And it must be a cross-functional exercise for any type of privacy program to really have legs and to make it sustainable on an ongoing basis.
So in terms of what we've seen with organizations today, we've seen a lot of companies doing a wait and see approach while watching their competition, reacting to the enforcement news. We think that's really going to change with a lot of these privacy regulations that are coming out, especially with the US. The interpretation of how that data is handled to conform with those privacy regulations varies between companies and legal teams. Sometimes those preferences are very customized. A lot of these companies are using consent management platforms to determine what tags should be triggered and when consent is gathered. But this is not a set it and just leave it and let it be maintained situation. It does seem like it is tied into not only the initial data strategy, but also an ongoing plan.
Yep, definitely agree.
That makes so much sense. And it sounds like, as the regulatory structure emerges, there's a lot of different ways that companies are kind of responding to that. And then kind of the other thing I'm hearing is there's not necessarily in a lot of organizations some sort of internal structure or central authority that is able to both manage the data today, as well as be potentially responsive to incoming regulation through some of these channels. So I think, regardless of sort of regulatory structure and they're emerging, and I loved your intro, Jody, because I think it just shows that this is not going away. We're just going to get more of this, but organizations still need to create business impact with data. And so, so first, John, I'd throw it to you, sort of, how do you see companies using data strategy to kind of navigate through that?
Yeah, so one of the things that we at Search Discovery advocate for is collecting data with purpose. And I really think that that's the foundation of having a solid data strategy that aligns with your privacy and with your privacy policies. So thinking about, let's not just collect everything because we can. We don't necessarily need to have every piece of information that we once could collect. And it used to be, very much Wild West. Let's grab everything and we'll keep it. And maybe we'll start to use this data, or at some point we'll use this data. But instead, we are seeing a dramatic shift towards how do we collect the data that we know we need to use. And many companies are doing this by assembling use cases, understanding what the outputs that they want to achieve are, and really having a good understanding of the marketing initiatives that will be fueled by this data. And so really thinking about what is the purpose of this data that we're collecting, not just to have data for information's sake, but to use it for a specific purpose.
Okay. No, I think that makes a ton of sense. And certainly, we can look to news stories in the past couple of months just about, say, like Facebook, in terms of how we see data collection being used. Potentially, maybe there was a purpose, and if that's true, then maybe it's sort of nefarious in terms of where user data started and then what it ended up being used for, down the line. So I think, it sounds like this need to establish sort of an overarching process and defining that strategy is really important. But I also feel like, just based on the years I've spent in this industry, this is an area where organizations can get lost really quickly, and execution can really fail. It doesn't achieve those outcomes. So I guess that's the next question, is sort of, how do we then take sort of these executable data strategies to provide better outcomes? So how do we organize around that?
Sure. So maybe I'll start with the concept of the executable strategy, because it's probably not familiar to everybody. Oftentimes data strategy takes a big bang approach. And by that I mean grandiose plan, very long-term horizon, hoping to accomplish monumental things. And we found that more often than not fails, or something changes in your org, or perhaps a policy changes or regulations change. So the response to that is the executable strategy, which is more like a series of sprints. And you will probably have many of these. So fortifying, let's first take an inventory of the data that we have. Let's understand, is there any PII in there? And if so, let's obfuscate it. And let's make sure that it's not going to cause us problems. So breaking out your capabilities and the tasks that go along with that into component parts, and being able to recognize progress and get some accomplishments that are going to fortify your overall strategy regarding privacy is really how we're looking at that. So the executable strategies they're smaller, kind of bite-sized pieces, if you will, that are going to help bolster your capabilities and hopefully safeguard you in the long term.
Okay, that makes a ton of sense. So I guess then the immediate follow-on I'm thinking of, Jody and Wendy, as you've been working with companies on data privacy specifically, does that track with your experience of who's being successful in doing this? And sort of maybe what are some examples that you've seen that are sort of connected to this?
Yeah, so I'm happy to start. So the companies that had that central person that are focused on this concept, and my favorite is this privacy by design idea. And they're thinking about, how does privacy and the data strategy pieces go together? So as John, you just were talking about, right? What data am I collecting? Am I collecting personally identifiable information? Oh, we stop. The privacy impact to that is I should obfuscate that. Well, that was a connection right there that if I didn't think about privacy, I wouldn't have thought about that in advance. But because I'm being proactive, maybe I've done a fancy word called a privacy impact assessment, really a questionnaire asking these privacy questions, I'm going to get to these nuts and bolts. And at the end, I'm going to have a really successful data strategy that's also privacy friendly. And we're going to achieve both of what we're looking for the best way.
And I would add, companies that are really successful at this understand what they have, that they're doing regular audits around what's being collected, what's out there, and tying that to purpose, reducing the personal information that's collected, but also reducing the information that's collected overall so that you can maintain and record that purpose, while designing that, providing that ability to opt out of data collection at that data collection point, as well as opting out of data sales.
Oh, I love that. So something immediately stood out to me, Jody, privacy by design. So I'd love to just sort of have you kind of give us a little bit better definition of that and how you've kind of defined it.
Yeah, so there's lots of formal definitions of privacy by design. The very simple version that I like to use is we're thinking first. We're literally designing privacy into a business process. So if I have a new marketing activity, I'm thinking about what are the privacy impacts, and I might be using a questionnaire to help guide me of the who, what, where, when, why, right, as a part of that. So it's really understanding the data that's being used, collected, shared, and then also thinking of the customer first, the end user. So what is my end user experience going to be? Am I going to be surprised by the message that I'm receiving, or I'm going to think, gosh, this was great. They really knew who I was because there was a really thoughtful data strategy behind that. And so I find it to be incredibly valuable. I take action on it. Company is happy. But in general, the whole idea is the more we prepare, the better off we are. We don't have any surprises. We won't run into any fines or regulations or breaking the laws or customer expectations, and also breaking any customer trust. Because to me, that's the most important thing about privacy. It's really about this trust relationship that we as a company or business have with our end customer, and what is it that they're expecting. And the point of privacy by design is we're thinking about that in advance, not all the way at the end when we're ready to hit the green light, but we thought about it the whole way through. And Wendy, I loved what you were talking about making sure we keep it up to date, because it's meant to be fluid. So I'm talking about this project, and then when I'm done with my project tomorrow, maybe I start a new project that's very similar and has impact, and I got to make sure I have all that, updated and connected.
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense. And so then the next thing I'm immediately thinking, and John and Wendy, I mean, you both have been in the digital analytics industry for many years, and John, you literally analyzed this industry. This really does fly in the face of how some of the way that we as an industry have thought about data collection and data management. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, how is that, how does this necessity, right, data privacy, and kind of have to force us to change our perspective in terms of how we think about even, basic data collection?
So the parable or the parallel to the web analytics world that I like to draw is if you're responsible for analytics and you've got a marketer that says, hey, I've got a campaign that's launching, can you put some tracking tags on this or some code so that we can collect some data? The analyst says, sure, I'd love to do that. When does it due? Oh, we're launching tomorrow. And that's exactly what you don't want to hear as an analyst. And the same is true for privacy as well. And I think one of the things that Jody keyed into, and you've written about this, is the time invested on the front end is invaluable here. So it does become a new way of working. And what we like to see, or what we advise or counsel clients, is think about the process and the workflow. If you've got a new data collection request, and a lot of our organizations that we work with now have a process for if you want a new piece of data, if you want a new tag on a page, and you're going to collect certain components or pieces of information, let's think about those. And potentially somebody in that workflow is responsible for thinking through, how does this impact privacy? Will this have an impact on the consumer experience? Are we collecting information about them that they might possibly not want us to have or might want back? And if so, how do we make sure that we are prepared for that? So it's really that time invested in the front end. It's not all too different than a process whereby you say, listen, you have to give 2 weeks lead time if you want a new tag on your page for a marketing initiative. The same is true of privacy. Let's get those individuals into the workflow so that they can think about it. They can make sure that they're prepared to be able to not only collect that data, but also to be able to give it back to the customer to get rid of it if they need to.
Right. I would add to that with data governance that there are additional steps than just adding that tag to the site anymore. There's updating documentation, making sure that we're maintaining not only what the purpose is, but where that data is flowing. Potentially it's how it's being used, so that we can also update consent management platforms, tag management systems on when someone's opted into that type of capability and when that tag should be served.
So I completely love these responses, and I'm going to ask a question, and I don't mean to put anyone on the spot, but this is, and I don't know the answer I'm seeking. So this is the little bit of Wild West, but are there tools that have been developed that help with this specific problem? Like, are there, and this is not not about to pitch a product to anybody. I just am really curious, like, I have not seen products in our space that do this. And so today it's sort of an amalgamation of a number of different processes. But are there emerging tools that will help with this?
So there are tools that will help from the kind of management aspect and making sure that, so from privacy by design. So, questionnaires and assessments and making sure that workflow is happening and the right people along the way. So some of the privacy management software, you could definitely use this through a workflow to make sure that we were thinking about privacy along certain steps. And then to tie that into the data governance piece. So they're kind of interconnected to the data documentation that, let's say, GDPR requires, or will help a company comply with CCPA. So you can kind of take the list of data elements that you would have in that conversation, and it would start to feed some of the data governance requirements from a GDPR point of view and a CCPA point of view.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thank you. You guys are so smart. And that you know the answer to this stuff. So, as I'm kind of been listening and sort of jotting some notes down, a couple of sort of key themes are emerging for me. And I think I want to kind of come back and get a little bit of feedback on some of these ideas. So early on, Jody, I heard you talk about sort of some kind of central sponsor or owner. And how can the folks on the webinar today kind of like take that information back in an applicable way? Maybe they are not that person in their organization. Where do they go to find that person? Or if that person doesn't exist, how do we help them sort of advocate for the empowerment of that? Or is it not necessarily a single individual, or should we be advocating for something like a steering committee concept? So I just want to explore that idea. And obviously, Wendy and John, feel free to chime in on this as well, based on your experience.
Sure. So a couple different thoughts. So in some situations, I work with big companies where there's a legal arm. So if anyone listening, if you fit in that bucket, privacy often starts in legal. So identify, who does legal think is the point person for privacy? It could be an attorney, it could be a privacy officer, it could be just an appointed person. If the organization doesn't have a legal arm, maybe there's a compliance arm, could start there. The next place it sometimes is appointed is the CFO, because risk, if there's a fine, kind of ends up in the CFO's lap. So I would probably start with identifying who is the privacy go-to person in our company, and starting with legal, compliance, risk, or the CFO. And if there is none, then the next question, Michael, as you just said, is, well, what do we do? So in some places, I'm that person for some companies, and the advocate for that need is really understanding how the data that you're collecting and what you're doing with it, and how you want to be, right? Everyone wants to be good data stewards, as John was talking about. We want to make sure that we meet all the data governance requirements that we should have and will help us in our business, as Wendy's been talking about. It will make us a better business and better for our customers. And if we start having that messaging, and I would raise it up to, right, whoever is sort of the lead of which department or group that you're in, and start to raise that conversation and get some, grassroots buy-in to be able to say, we really need some help here. This is important to our business, our project, our customers. And then, hopefully from there, it will translate into getting the right help that you need, whether that be someone internal is appointed, it's a steering committee, it's external, whichever the right answer is.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is, and not to encourage anybody to go running around their organizations claiming that the sky is falling, but potentially, if you cannot get somebody's attention, if that's a challenge for you, talk about the potential repercussions of not complying with privacy. And you can point to Google as a company that's already, had a GDPR violation. All of us can calculate what the fees and fines could be potentially. So if that's what you need to gather or to garner enough attention to be able to do something, that's potentially another way to be able to at least shed some light on the issue.
Great point.
All right. Any other thoughts, Wendy?
I would say if this is starting from an analytics team, to do that data inventory and start to prepare the types of information that you're collecting to share with your management team, and potentially bring in a privacy professional like Jody to do some education to help understand the impact.
Great. So I think the next thing that really kind of has stood out to me so far is definitely heard from everyone, there needs to be planning up front, right? And so sort of, John, to your point about collecting data with purpose. So obviously definition of purpose then is something you've got to do as part of a pre-data collection step. And I think, others did too. And then Wendy, you kind of brought out the point of also iteratively regularly auditing, updating documentation, things like that to kind of encounter that. The intersection with reality that I want us to kind of grapple with a little bit is everyone, all of us, we are in the middle of executing on goals, objectives, and those kinds of things. It is probably not a luxury that most organizations have to kind of stop and do a large planning cycle. How much can we break this down into, smaller pieces for people so that it's still maybe, John, an executable data strategy and not an executable data tactic or something? How do you advise companies in that regard, just to try to make this a little more real for folks?
So the first place I generally start is take a project. Start with a project. Well, actually, first, I like what Wendy, you had suggested, which is start with your data inventory. So I really think the very first place to start with is knowing what data you have, because you actually really can't comply with any of these laws or even meet your own customer expectations if we have no idea what data we have. So you really do need to kind of take that step, and each department can do it, each team can do it, each project can do it, and then poof, before you know it, you have all the pieces that you need. And in terms of the planning element, it probably sounds like, oh my goodness, this whole extra set of questions and thought that I need to have, but it really should just start to be very natural. Just like we probably ask, how many people do we need? How long will it take? How much will it cost? The privacy questions should just start to be fluid. And then when you run into, a bigger question or a bigger issue like you do today with a resource or a budget, right, you raise that up. So the foundational layer is to start with what you have and just ask some very basic questions in a project. Just pick one. What am I doing? What am I collecting? Who am I using it? Where is it going? The kind of how, so collection, use, sharing, storing. And just start with those very initial questions. And then from there, kind of naturally, we'll hopefully start to meander through the organization and start meeting the other requirements. But just start with what you got and how you're using it.
Anybody else?
I would also add there are tools out there that you can use to scan your site. So that's another way that you could quickly kind of get an idea of what is out there if you don't already know, if you don't have a centralized process or a centralized team. We've also created custom tools to go out and scan containers, Google Analytics containers, to determine what is being collected. So sometimes that can speed up that inventory process.
Great. All right. And then I think another kind of area that I want to kind of delve into is sort of the concept of fluidity and iteration and sort of how important that is. And we've touched on it a little bit, but I just want to give us a chance to kind of talk about that just a little more and kind of how you've seen that work effectively, both from a data strategy perspective as well as from a privacy perspective. And then we've got a couple questions from the folks on the line. So we'll start diving into those here in just a minute. And if you have a question, please get it in so we can get it answered here over the next little bit.
John, you want to start with the data strategy?
Sure, yeah. And I mean, I think the necessity to be fluid is apparent, right? You have to be. Things change. The constant evaluation of marketing technologies and overall business technologies that we're using in today's environment can be overwhelming. And because of that, you need to be adaptive in what you're doing. You know, the one example that I would bring up is a lot of our customers now are looking at CDPs, customer data platforms, and thinking about how do we start to amass profiles so that we can market more effectively to our customers. And if your privacy policy doesn't include that as part of, or consider how do we do this and how do we make sure that this data will comply with the regulations that are in front of us, you'll be stuck. So you need to be able to consider things that come up and be able to adapt. And as with things in the governance realm, a lot of times what we encourage clients to do is come up with an overarching policy. And then hopefully, you may have to adapt that policy, but many of the tactics or the executional components will fall under policy. And then you have a plan for what to do and you can move forward with that. But really kind of thinking about, how do we build something that is a plan that allows us to operate within a changing environment? And how do we make changes and prioritize things as they come up? Having a plan to do that falls under the data strategy component.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think, John, you hit on a really important part on the privacy notice piece, which to me, if you think about the fundamentals, we want to ask the question, can we use this data? That's a legal privacy law part. And then if we check the box there, the next question to me is, should we use that data? Right? And then that really starts to get into that strategy and the ethics and all of it kind of combined. Where did we get it from? And that trust element of what does the end customer expect? And we all want to make sure that we're making the best choices so that we're yielding the results we want, right? That's the whole point of what we're here for. So if we ask those questions of what does our privacy notice say? What does our company policy say? What does the law say? What do we need to do? Do we need to document anything? We have kind of the can covered. And then we start asking, should we? Is that in line with what we're trying to accomplish with our goals and our end ROI expectations? And then when the answer to that is yes, we've addressed what we needed to in a pretty fluid, it wasn't just this random kind of privacy afterthought type manner, but throughout the process.
All right, great. So we've got actually some questions that have come in. Before we jump into questions, I love this conversation. I think there's a couple key things that really stood out to me as sort of immediate next step takeaways for folks that can listen in. I also, as I reflect on this, as a practitioner and someone in this space, I do find it challenging not to feel this sense of doom or, oh, woe is us, that we have to now take all these things on. But as I reflect on it, I actually potentially see this as an area of sort of pretty exciting transformation for data and analytics as an industry, in that this stuff really matters, and using it with purpose can really drive business results. And I love this idea of starting with something as simple as a data inventory that you create and maintain on a single project, building that into a set of strategies and a grouping of people to pursue data privacy from a centralized level within your organization, and slowly moving out across your organization to kind of mitigate and adhere to sort of the regulations we've got in place. All right. So one of the questions we've got, I'll just go ahead and read it off, is from Yang Liu from Robert Half. Good introduction to GDPR from e-privacy. Aside from what we've heard today, another relevant and pressing question is, as a marketer, if we need to utilize PII in certain circumstances, what are some of the justifications for using this data?
John, you want to go ahead? Looks like you're about to start.
Go, you take it away, Jody.
So I was just going to say, so from a GDPR perspective, if you collect the data for one purpose, and you want to use it for another purpose, you have to go through kind of the analysis to determine what it is you're using it for, and did you provide the right notice and the right choice, and then did you document whatever it is that you're trying to do. So I'm hoping that addresses your question from that perspective. If not, Yang, feel free to add a little bit more to that. The e-privacy is also another EU regulation, so it's going to be pretty similar. They're very focused on collect data for the purpose you need, use it for the purpose you need, and then don't use it again unless you've gone through this analysis that I've just described. The US is a little bit different. The US is more of, tell me what you're doing and give me some choices. And generally speaking, from a legal law perspective, you can kind of keep using it, with the exception of financial and healthcare. But we want to be mindful of our customer expectations, and that's where I think the data strategy piece really comes into play. So, and to me, that can and should. So I might be able to from a legal perspective, but then should I use it? And that gray zone is really important, because again, to me, this whole privacy piece is around trust, and we want to make sure that we're meeting our customers' expectations on that. So John, I don't know if you have anything else you want to add to that.
No, I think that's good. I mean, the consent, upfront is important as well. But yeah, I think understanding how, or using it for intended purposes, and then like you mentioned, doing that analysis. That's kind of what it comes down to.
I would add it for using PII to ensure that it's secure, and using something like a SHA-256 hash with a salt. Certainly having consent and then retaining that opt-in through your segments to your destinations, and looking for that, whether you're using a DMP or a CDP.
All right, excellent. All right, another question is, how do you define the difference between data privacy and data ethics?
So there's a fine line. Well, I'm sorry, no, there's more of a gray zone to me in that area. So privacy is all about the use and collection of data. And a part of that is security. So a lot of people, when I tell them I do privacy work, they're like, oh, you're security. No, that's just a little part of it. So it's all around that use and collection. And the use and collection piece is, well, you gave me information. I'm going to engage in this transaction with you. I'm going to market to you. And then what else am I going to do with it? Is it reasonable for me to think that you're going to sell it? Is it right? Was that my expectation? I bought something from you and now you're sharing it. Did I expect you were going to do that? That to me kind of crosses into the ethics piece of, was that what I, as a customer, thought you would do with my data? Am I okay with that? Did you tell me about it? Did you give me choices about it? Or that's just what you do? So, if we think about ethics in our everyday life, right, the more transparent you are, the more honest we are, the more we're upfront, we feel more comfortable. To me, it's the same thing in a data exchange situation, right? How can I use this data in a manner that's consistent with your expectations?
Great. All right, we have another question, and this one is in regards to HIPAA. I don't know if that's a different set of regulations, but I'll throw it to the panel and you guys can tell me whether you want to try to tackle this one. But what are the most recent guidelines as it pertains to email and compliance with HIPAA?
I presume that is, Jonathan, regarding marketing email for HIPAA. So there hasn't been any changes to the HIPAA rules. So that might be one we talk a little bit offline, but if I'm collecting that information from, it kind of just depends, I think, on the data that I've collected from a situation. So let's say I went to a doctor's office, I went to the hospital, and I'm a patient of theirs, it's reasonable for them to communicate with me as expected. I need to also comply with the CAN-SPAM Act, which is the federal email marketing law. So there hasn't been any changes to the HIPAA rules to date. And if I have confused you further or not answered your question, by all means reach out and I'm happy to address that further.
Okay. Another question is coming in about, is there a regulatory acceptable way to take data from an approved process, anonymize it, and then use it in other aggregated analyses? And I feel like, Wendy, in your description of sort of doing, when you secure through encryption and those kinds of things, you kind of made a little bit of maybe a little bit of an intro to that as a concept. So I don't know, maybe you want to kind of weigh in on that.
Yeah, so I think it's important to recognize that data privacy includes online identifiers or IDs that can be tied back to an individual. So even if it is hashed, that still is an identifier that can be tied back to an individual. So that still falls under data privacy and those considerations.
So then can we do that, or what would we need to do to be able to kind of follow that scenario?
I think if you removed all IDs and did roll it up to kind of an aggregated level, that potentially, depending on the classifications of information that was contained in that, could be acceptable.
Okay. So
and probably also declaring that you're going to do that, the intent behind it. I think if it's an afterthought, and Jody, correct me if I'm wrong, if it's an afterthought, that's where it becomes problematic. But if you describe ahead of time, this is, we intend to use this as aggregate anonymous data as well, potentially that's where you'd be able to get around that.
Yeah, it's all about that, as you just described, I need to be transparent. So I've told you I'm collecting it for this purpose and I need to use it for this purpose. Oh, and from a GDPR point of view, you have to literally document the business activity that you're using it for that purpose. Oh, you want to use it for another purpose? You have to go through the same analysis for that next purpose and pretend you're going to do that 5 times over. It's kind of that same concept. And then depending on what that aggregate analysis is doing, it has to sort of tie back a bit to this overall privacy, ethics, transparency conversation that we're having. What are you doing with that? Because even though it might be at an aggregate level, depending on how you're using that, will that be okay for me? Or will I call it the scratch your head test. Will I be confused when I get some type of targeted message, but it was totally aggregate, but I can kind of figure out how you got that information? Or is it going to be okay? And then it's okay. So you just have to go through that analysis of what you're trying to do.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question because I really like it and I think it's a great topic for us to dig into. So do you think data privacy can sometimes be used as a sort of masquerade or a way to keep data in silos and not let go of data ownership? And sort of what is the best way to approach when, in essence, politics gets involved in these situations?
So I can take a shot at that one. I don't think it's used as a masquerade. I think it goes to sort of who owns privacy, and that might be part of why it doesn't always have a perfect owner, why you're also starting to see, chief data officers, because someone needs to really look at the holistic view of data. I don't think data should stay in silos. I do believe it should, someone should be aware of everything that's happening to be able to create the right strategy holistically and individually at a project level. And privacy is really just a layer on top of that. It can seem in some situations that privacy might inhibit certain behaviors, but really it's meant to make companies be thoughtful about how they're using data. And it's not meant to never use it again. It's meant to be thoughtful and really put the customer first. So I would suggest that it's really about flipping it and using data as a competitive advantage, really being thoughtful in the strategy that you're trying to deploy, the use cases that you have, and make that be a differentiator to be able to reach and target your end customer. And privacy is just a step to help you get there.
Yeah, I think, and the way I perceived the question was more not is data privacy good or bad, but sort of how do you effectively manage when data privacy is being used aggressively in an organization to shut down the ability to
okay. I misread that. I didn't see it that way.
Well, and I don't want to read too much into it, but I would just wanted to juxtapose those two things, because my assumption is everybody on the call today is pretty stoked about data privacy because that's why they're here. Well, so I don't know. Anybody have thoughts on that?
I was going to put on my my data strategy psychologist hat and say, do you have trust issues in your organization? Is there? It's a cultural thing, really. It's transparency is always the best bet. Communication. I'm not sure that there's masquerading going on, but we've certainly seen plenty of examples where you get data hoarders within an organization, and they don't want you to have the data because they're afraid that you'll misuse it in some way. And overcoming that with education and data literacy programs and trust really is one of the best ways that we've seen that.
Yeah. Okay. Outstanding. Again, we're a little over our time, but hopefully everyone is finding some value there. I want to give a very huge thank you to our three panelists. I really enjoyed having this conversation today. Jody Daniels, your expertise is so amazing. And so folks that are interested in continuing this conversation past this point, make a note. Red Clover Advisors is her company. And really appreciate you coming on today, Jody. Thanks for spending the time with us.
Oh, delighted. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
And a big thank you to our other two panelists as well. Wendy, thank you for bringing your expertise. Love your work, obviously.
Thanks for having me.
And John, thank you. Because I think the work that you do and how it meets data privacy is sort of the original idea for this webinar. So thank you so much for bringing your insight as well.
Absolutely. Thanks, Michael.
All right. Well, thanks all of you for listening in today. We did record the session, so I believe at some point this will be available for download and folks can re-listen. So if there are folks in your organization, feel free to contact us either at Search Discovery or at Red Clover Advisors, and we can definitely do any follow-up or answer other questions you might have if we're able to. Again, thank you very much. Thanks to our panelists, and thanks for your time, and have a great rest of your afternoon and week.
Thank you.